Awesome, awesome. So, first of all, thank you all for joining today who are able to make it. We're excited to share some information that's really valuable. At the end of the day, and we're kind of in that season where it's important to kind of get ahead of the game for E-rate, then kind of be chasing it down and rushing to the finish line. So you can be purposeful with around those dollars, what you want to use them for, what's best to use them for, things of that nature. My name is James Pope with Technology Lab. I've got my colleagues Brian Hayden and Connor O'Neill on here with me, along with really the star of the show, Mr. John Hughes from CAS. John can give you his background here in a second, but John's very knowledgeable around the E-rate process and has been doing this for a lot of schools for a very long time. And we ran into John just with mutual schools that we work with, and really wanted him to be involved in this and hear the ins and outs from a real expert at the end of the day. And just before we get started, if you don't know much about us, Technology Lab, did want to give a quick recap so that once this call is over, we do have a place in the process of helping you get prepared for E-rate and what you may want to budget for and put into your 470s, which Sean will talk about. But we're an IT services provider based out of Nashville, Tennessee, but we serve about 120 to 130 schools, K-12 education in the Southeast, a large number, probably 80% of those schools being charter. So we've been doing this for 12 years. We provide help desk support. We provide management of devices, networks. Ultimately, we either become part of your team, your internal IT team, or if you don't have an internal IT team, we can become your entire IT team. So it just kind of depends on your school and how you run things. But we'd certainly love a conversation, after this at some point. But for today, this is really all about making sure that you guys are prepared for E-rate and the E-rate season. So with that being said, I'll kind of move it on to introduce, like I said, the star of our webinar today, Mr. John Hughes. John, I'll let you kind of take it from here. Love to share a little bit about your background, and then I'll move these slides along for you as you're going through.
Okay. My name is John Hughes. I run CAS. We are a E-rate consulting firm. We have about 350 clients now nationally. We're in 26 different states. We do everything from small little private schools to great big school districts to libraries and to charter schools. And we do business with charter schools all over the country, a number of them in Florida, as a matter of fact. We do our best to make the whole E-rate process as painless for you as possible. That's our goal.
Awesome. John, go ahead, John. No, go ahead. Sorry.
I would say as we go through the presentation, the last couple slides I won't really talk about. They'll be kind of about why to use a consultant and a little bit more about what we do. But we'll stick for this presentation to what E-rate's all about.
Awesome. John, I'll move this along, but before I do that, I did want to let everybody know that's attending. If you have questions, definitely don't have to wait till the end. You can utilize the chat or the Q&A functions on Zoom, in your browser. So feel free to just launch questions when you have them. Don't have to wait till the end. It's probably better to ask them in the moment on the slide that is pertinent to. So just feel free to ask questions along the way. We want this to be as engaging as valuable to you guys as possible. So John, I'll kick it back to you and get started.
Great. So let's just start. The program was started back when Al Gore invented the internet, and it was a bipartisan program that was started between him and Senator Rockefeller and Olympia Snow. So it was definitely a bipartisan thing. And the idea was originally to get internet and telecommunications into rural communities, and that was expanded to all communities. And they decided that the program would be for these following people who are eligible. That would be public school districts, charter schools, private schools, public libraries, And depending on how your state classifies a school, that can include Head Start, pre-K, juvenile justice, adult education, and special education. They follow your state's law on what they consider to be a valid entity. Next slide. What's eligible? The eligibility is broken down into two categories. One is called Category 2, and the other one is category. One's Category 1, the other one's Category 2. Category 1 is about your recurring services, and it's basically the internet to your building. So that could be your internet service if you just have one school, or it could be if you have multiple campuses, it could be your WAN connection. So that would be the connection that sends data between the two schools. That would also be eligible. How you determine how much you get off is determined by your free and reduced discount percentage. You do not have to offer free and reduced lunch, but you have to determine how many students are eligible. And the state normally uses your October numbers for that. And they happen for the state of Florida to be out right now. So they're very easy to look up and put into the system. And basically you end up getting between a 20 and 90% discount. To get a 40% discount, you only need to have 1% of your students eligible. So very few people get a 20% discount. Most of it's between 40 and 90. One final comment on Category 1. Category 1, you get those discounts every single year. It's based on how much money you're willing to spend. There's no cap or limit on that. Category 2 services, which is for networking equipment and services, you get between a 20 and 85% discount on that. The maximum discount is 85 instead of 90, just so that you're having to put up more money, since this is something that they want to make sure is competitively bid. It's based on your same discount rates as before, based on your free and reduced eligibility amount. Now, the thing about Category 2 is that you get $167 per student pre-discount. So let's say your discount rate's 80%. You would get 80% of $167 per student. The minimum amount you can receive is $25,000 over the 5-year period. So, if you've only got 60 students, you're still getting $25,000. And that can be spread over the 5-year period, however you want to do it. It can be all at once. It can be a little bit each year. It can be in this, equal amounts every year. However you want to do it is just fine. One final comment on that. The 23-24 year, which is what we're starting to apply for now, and what the formal applications will be starting soon, is year 3 of the first 5-year budget. So if you haven't used any Category 2 money, then initially you'll have 3 years to spend your total budget. All right, Category 1 services. We mentioned before, it's internet or wide area network services. You can also have firewall bundled as a service. So this would be separate from if you have a firewall or anything. This would be a vendor-owned firewall where the vendor is offering you firewall service as part of their internet. The neat thing about that is that firewall then gets moved into Category 1, and you don't have to use your firewall money for Category 2. Not a whole lot of people offer this. For instance, AT&T doesn't offer it, Comcast, Spectrum, those sort of people don't offer this service. But there are some vendors out there who do, so there's definitely some people who follow through with that.
Hey, John.
Yep.
Question about that. So let's say, are you able to utilize Category 1 if the provider that's not providing the internet, or it would have to be the provider that's providing
it has to be a provider who provides internet. There are some service providers like yourself who resell internet and bundle it with firewall, and that's how it gets there. And that's not an uncommon thing to find. There's usually, in any market, there's usually 1 or 2 people who are doing that.
Yeah, and I would say from our I guess, expertise in our side of the house. If the one caveat to having that firewall tied to your internet provider is that if anything goes wrong on your network, usually the first troubleshooting place to start is going to be your firewall. And a lot of times, if that firewall is tied to your internet provider, then it makes it a longer process to resolve that issue, because we all know that internet providers aren't always the fastest on the support side of things. So definitely you want to keep that in mind, because we've had situations where we've been supporting schools that had when we first started working with them, they were already had it set up that way with like a, let's say, an AT&T or something like that or whatever. And we found, for the first 2 years we were supporting them, where they were, obligated to keep that firewall there, it was harder to manage and resolve issues on a network-wide basis. And then once they kind of came out of that contract, they actually moved that firewall over to a managed one that we were able to manage, without the help of an internet provider. So anyway, just one thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about that.
Sure. And then the next thing that's eligible is special construction of fiber. You can construct your own fiber network. In reality, that is not going to be something that a charter school is likely to go do. But if you wanted to run your fiber, if you had two campuses and you wanted to construct your own fiber connection between the two buildings, that could get paid for as category 1. It is something that larger school districts are doing quite often, but it's not something that normally apply to a charter school. Mobile data networks would be the other thing that would be covered. That's only covered if you can't get proper internet service where you are. The reality, that won't apply to most charter schools. That applies to things like bookmobiles at a library, or something on or internet reception on a reservation somewhere where there's just not adequate internet service. So that's up there, but that's not a daily part of things. Next thing, category 2 services. Category 2 services is broken down into 3 pieces. Internal connections, which is going to be your equipment. Basic maintenance of internal connections, which is your support contracts on that equipment. And managed internal broadband services, which is your network management that somebody like James could provide you. Next slide, because we'll go into each one of those a little bit in detail. Internal connections. So this is the equipment that basically runs your network. So this would be switches, wireless access points, routers and controllers, cabling and wiring, firewall. One thing to keep in mind about firewall is not normally 100% E-ratable. It's normally like 70% on average E-ratable, and that's because firewalls have a component of it that is filtering, and filtering is not E-rate eligible. Doesn't really make any sense, because you have to have filtering to be compliant and have E-rate, but it's not E-rate eligible.
One of the most important things of a firewall.
Exactly. There is discussion on changing that rule, and hopefully it'll change at some point, but there's been discussion for years on it. The next one is caching servers are eligible. It is the only kind of server that is eligible. A application server that you're running your email or something like that on, or educational programs, is not eligible. Caching servers to speed your internet connection up are eligible. And there also can be cost allocated. So if you have a server that's being used for caching functions and something else, you can get cost allocated out and get a portion of that server covered. Racks and shelves are eligible that are used to handle any of the things above. So if you've got, racks for your switches, that would count. Use UPS to support any of that. UPS to back up your computer is not eligible, but UPS to back up your switches is eligible. UPS to back up a caching server is eligible. And then support for software to support any of the above is eligible. So if you have Meraki access points and they have 5-year licensing that goes with that, that's considered software, and that's eligible as part of the program. The same goes for your switches. It's normally something to do with controlling your Wi-Fi. That type of stuff would be eligible. With the kind of software that would not be eligible would once again be stuff that would be considered an end user thing. So it would be stuff that management of end user devices, management of Apple products or something. That is not E-rate eligible because that's considered to be managing an end user product that has to be managing your internal connections to be eligible. Next slide.
And if I can say something about this side before moving on, John, one thing that we see on the vendor side when we come into the mix is sometimes the biggest mistake that a school will make is they will not have a real clear picture, all right, of what type of internal connections they actually need, right? They'll just kind of like, hope and guess or not really know the differences in type and, many times aren't thinking about the long term, right? Because remember, once you purchase this equipment through E-rate, you are legally obligated to be using it for 5 years. So when you're picking what you need to be thinking about what you need for the next 5 years, whether that's you growing, right? Year by year, depending upon where you're at and the growth of your school, or just what type of equipment you actually need in order to provide the best performance. So just know that that's a key part of this is making sure that you have somebody or somebody internally you trust around the IT side or externally, somebody, a company like us or somebody else that can actually walk you through, okay, here's an assessment of where you're at. Here's an assessment of the next 5 years. This is what you should be primarily utilizing those dollars on. And here's what we would recommend you kind of put in your bid or whatever the case may be, your 470.
Perfect. Next thing that tells us is basic maintenance. It has to be a pay-as-you-go. It can't be a block of hours that you're purchasing. You can purchase an estimated number of hours, and then when you submit for reimbursement, it has to be on what you spent. One of the key things about E-rate, which I didn't mention earlier, is E-rate is not a grant program. E-rate is a rebate program. You must spend the money to get the money. So your discount rate that we talked about earlier, if you're getting an 80% discount rate, you don't get that 80% until you've spent the money. So basic, and I'm going to have one other little comment about basic maintenance before going into too much more. This is the most reviewed portion of E-rate. If you ever have the opportunity to get something classified as network management, which will be the next thing we talk about, versus basic maintenance, you want it to be network management because they make getting the rebate for basic maintenance inordinately complicated. I actually wish they'd get rid of the category with how much of a pain they've made it recently. But there are some things that can only be basic maintenance, like your firewall license renewal is considered basic maintenance because that's how it's been negotiated out. That's not the case for an access point. But for a firewall, for some reason, the licensing's got to be considered basic maintenance. It's basically to be used for software upgrades and patches. It can be for wire and cable maintenance, but once again, I encourage people to make all of that stuff part of a management contract. So let's go to the next slide. Management of internal broadband service. So this is services that are provided by a third party for the operation and management monitoring of internal connections. This can be done in two different ways. One, it can be equipment that you currently own or will own, or it can be done as leased third-party equipment. So you could contract out with somebody and they would own the equipment and manage it for you. Either one of those ways is accurate. And it includes the activation, the installation, the configuration, and on-site training of staff. Anything that is network related. So if you have a management contract and the management contract says X amount of this management contract is for the management of laptops, that portion will not be eligible. But if the management contract says it's for networking equipment to manage the network, that's eligible. And that can be to do things that could fall into that maintenance category before, as I said. The management is, the hiring an IT firm to come in and help you with the upkeep of your network. And this is relatively easy to get your reimbursement for. They don't ask a lot of questions on it. So this is the category whenever possible you put those maintenance and management items into. I'll say this is traditionally versus maintenance is done as a monthly fee. It does not have to be done as a monthly fee. It can be done as an hourly thing as well, but this is traditionally done as a set monthly fee. And that was the original way it was distinguished between maintenance, but they've become a little more broad in how they'll fund that now.
One thing I'd like to add here that we see, John, is we've had many instances where we've been in conversations with a potential new school that we're going to work with, and they did manage and control broadband services, which I would highly recommend utilizing because it can offset some of your support costs on the network side. But what I would recommend is if you're going to use managed control broadband services, that you own your equipment. Because a lot of times what we see is that there'll be a vendor in there where they bid on the managed control broadband services, and then as part of the managed control broadband services, they included rental basically of like switches and access points. The problem with that can become that you're not real happy with that vendor, right? And they don't do a very good job for you, but you're stuck with them now because they own the equipment, right? So now you've got to be stuck with that vendor supporting that for the next 5 years. So from our perspective, it's best to own your equipment yourself, utilize the E-rate funds on the Category 2 funds that you have to get the equipment that you need, and then utilize the other part of the E-rate funds, that Category 2 funds that you may have for, somebody to support it, a company to come in to support it. That way they're separated. And if you did want to leave, right, and not work with that company or that support partner anymore, for whatever the reason is, you're not tied to them, and it's not as hard to get away because they're not renting you that equipment. So just something that we've seen over the years that can get a little sticky. So if you can do it right on the front end where you're purchasing and then doing the managed control broadband separately, we've seen it's a lot cleaner for you as a school.
I would concur with that statement. Mostly when people do a lease thing is when they're a small private school and they're just opening and they don't have any money, so they really don't have a choice. Or you don't see that often in the charter community anymore. All right, the rest of the slides here, which I'm sure James will be sending out to everybody, kind of go into why to use a consultant and why CAS is a great place to but I'm not going to go through that now because that's not really the point of this, but feel free to read through that, and if anybody has any questions, they can contact me. What I do want to go through right now off the slide is a little bit about what the timing is of E-rate. Currently, people are starting to file their 470s. You may have started to file your own 470. Now is the time when you need to be starting to move on E-rate. What is open right now is called the admin window, and that's when people can go in there and update your free and reduced numbers, your enrollment numbers, your addresses, and just make sure the system is all correct. That is going to be open probably through the end of December. They haven't actually announced when it's going to close. They'll announce it's closing in 2 weeks, and you'll have that amount of time. You can still make changes after that time, but it's much more complicated. So right now is when you want to be going in and making sure everything's correct in the system. And then the next deadline is going to be, the first part of E-rate is you have to request quotes. You can't just go hire anybody you want. You got to request quotes and have those quotes sit out there for 28 days. And you do that through filing something called a Form 470. The Form 470 is what people are filing right now. So if they're looking through the list, want to get access points, they go, I need to get 48 access points, and they put that on the Form 470. You do not have to do a formal RFP. You can link a formal RFP to the 470 if you want to. You do not have to do a formal RFP, but you do have to file a Form 470 and have it out there for 28 days. After that, you file something called a Form 471, which is the formal application. And that can be filed any time after 28 days. now. After the 470's been out there for 28 days. Now, the reason I don't have dates up here right now is they haven't announced any of these dates. They for some reason, this program can't ever like think way in advance. But the Form 471, the due date will be in late March sometime. So then you'll count back 28 days from that. So the Form 470, the due date will be in late February sometime. And the admin window closes a week before the 471 window opens, which normally is sometime in the beginning of January. So sometime between the end of December and the first week of January is when the admin window closes. So that's kind of how we back into what we know about dates right now. After you file your Form 470, after you choose your vendors and file your Form 471, which is a formal application, they'll start reviewing the applications and asking you questions about them, or asking your consultant questions about them, so that you can, they can validate that you're getting what you need. And often they approve people before the next school year starts, because Category 1 services run on the standard fiscal year, which is July 1st to June 30th. Usually you get funded before July 1st. If for some reason you don't, it will be retroactive back to July 1st. Category 2 services run a little bit longer than Category 1 services because they understand that installing equipment takes some time. So Category 2 services go 3 months on either side. They start April 1st and run through September 30th the next year. So this 23-24 application, which is beginning to be worked on now, would run from April 1st, 2023 to September 30th, 2024. Once again, you may not get funded before April 1st. You may not get funded before July 1st, but it's retroactive to that time period. That's kind of the overview of it. The other, well, hang on, let's touch on one more thing here, what to do with funding. How you get your discounts back. You can get your discounts back one of two ways. You can get your discounts back by filing something called a bear form, which gives you a lump sum reimbursement. Or you can get your reimbursements back by filing something called a SPI form, which is something your service provider would file for you. So let's say you're an 80% discount school. The service provider would charge you 20% and then file with USAC to get the 80% back directly with them. In order to be able to do that, you have to have already been funded. So often if you're funded later, then you go ahead and pay the bill and then get reimbursed. But if you were funded way up ahead of time, then many vendors can do the SPI method with you, which allows you to be out less money out of pocket. Not all vendors can do that for sort of different reasons. It might become complicated, but when it's possible, that makes it easier accounting wise. That would be my overview. Does anybody have any questions?
We have any questions in the chat? I don't think we have any questions right now yet, do we, Brian or Connor? I did want to, go ahead, Brian.
Nope, nothing out there. If you guys do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat right now. We're watching.
Okay. I think in the meantime, like John, I know like these last couple slides, some of it is geared towards, specifically what you guys do at CAS, but a lot of it's very broad, and I think it's somewhat important. So for instance, why use a consultant, I'll kind of kick that part off, we come across a lot of situations because we're not a consultant, right? We're a vendor who's bidding on the services. So, we come across a lot of situations where a school is trying to do this on their own, or maybe, it gets tied in with a consultant that's not very detailed, et cetera. And then they get audited, which I think John will mention here in a second, but they make the process rather, yep.
We do have a question. Sorry, when you're done, I'll read that out.
Okay. I was just going to say they make the process rather complicated, right? It is free money from the federal government. So the process isn't always so easy. And even more importantly than that, administratively, there's just a lot of things to do along the way. And why that's probably most important is because let's say 3 years after you utilize the E-rate program, if you were to get audited, if you didn't do the process correctly, right, and you missed a step or you did something incorrectly or wrong, then you're potentially at jeopardy, right, of that audit not going in your favor, and then having to be reimbursing, or paying back some of the money that you got or all the money that you got, just depending upon what happened or what the situation is. Just quite frankly, though, it's just a lot of work. And most consultants, John will tell you, it's a very small percentage of the dollars that are in your budget is kind of how the payment works, and it's more than worth it to not kind of get yourself in a situation like that, or even more importantly, just not have to get into the weeds of all the administrative work that goes along with the program itself. So I'll kind of stop that soapbox there. But John, I didn't know if you had anything to add around that.
Sure. No, I mean, probably the number one reason to use a consultant is what happens if you get audited, because auditors and reviewers like to act like they're your friend, but if you say something wrong to them, bad things happen. So having somebody who's used to talking to them and helping out with that is the number one reason to have a consultant. I always compare it to doing your taxes too, when it comes to the process. People are familiar with hiring a consultant, particularly the more complicated their taxes are, or hiring an accountant, particularly the more complicated their taxes are. For an accountant, a lot of it's not that difficult, right? Because they're doing this hundreds and hundreds of times. But for you, you're doing it once, and keeping up with all the little rules and regulations and how things are done are become difficult. That's why I use an accountant. That's why I think people ought to use an E-rate consultant. What's that question we have? And then
yeah. So Jody had asked if can you file more than one 470, one for category 1 and one for category 2, and then combine on the 471?
Yes, you may. And as a matter of fact, often people come up with something they filed for access points, and suddenly they realize that if they get all these new access points, they're going to need 2 new switches because they don't have enough ports. And so then they go up and they file another 470 for those switches. You can file as many 470s as you'd like. You do not have to purchase everything on your 470s. Your 470s can be a wish list of things you'd like to get quotes on. For the 471, the only thing about 471s, and you can file as many of those as you'd like as well, is that a 471 can only be for category 1 or category 2. So if you get doing category 1 and category 2, you do have to file at least 2 471s. But you can combine multiple 470s on any 471. So you might have 3 different category 2 470s that you're using for your category 2 470.
Jody, did that answer your question? Thumbs up, maybe.
Sure did.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Any other questions in there, guys, or any other questions out there? I'll I want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I know we're all busy coming in the year here. We've spent about 36 minutes here, and there's some. If you have other questions or you want to dive deeper into this, or you just want to learn more. Yep.
Sorry, one more question from Jody. The question was about the cost around an E-rate consultant. What does that look like? What would you expect to pay a consultant?
E-rate consultants either charge a percentage or they charge by the hourly or by thing. I'll tell you how I personally charge, which actually is on the lower end of things. I charge 5% of what I get you successfully funded for, with a minimum of $250. So in a year that I did a lot for somebody, I would charge more because I'm getting them lots of funding. But on a year where I'm just doing their internet, then it doesn't come out to be all that much. So it kind of ends up being commensurate with the work. And my fee is fully contingent on you being funded. So if you don't get funded, you don't pay anything. There are some people who charge a flat fee and then a percentage behind it. There's some people who charge an hourly rate. It all generally works out close to the end thing. I think I find this is easy because just one number is easier to deal with for me.
Absolutely. Brian, any other questions in there?
That is it for now.
Okay. Well, this is obviously being recorded, so we're going to share this recording out to everybody that joins, so you can have it. There are some additional slides that we didn't go through that are specific to what John and his team can do on the consulting side, so you can kind of look through those. I've got obviously some contact information up here for John and his team, so you'll have that information as well. You'll also have our information at Technology Lab with Brian and Connor on here. But I think the most important thing for you guys to consider is, one, having making sure that when you're going through the E-rate process, you're doing it diligently and you're preparing for it and you have a strategy for it. And there's two parts to that, right? There's the part of the administrative side of actually, what John and his team do as far as getting to those dollars that are available to you. But there's some pre-work that has to be done too. Like I said earlier, right? If you're going to have to keep this equipment or this service for 5 years, you're going to want to make sure that what you put out to bid and what you're actually choosing really suffices and is going to perform for you as a school. So one thing that we do as a last caveat is we'll do an IT assessment for your entire school and do an assessment and audit of your network, areas of opportunity, where the gaps are, and also in the systems, et cetera, et cetera. So it allows for you to then go, okay, well, based upon this is what we need to do, or this is what we'd like to be able to use our dollars on, and get with your E-rate person to fill out that form 470 out to bid correctly. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out. But otherwise, I'm sure we'll be in touch in the future in some capacity, no matter what state you're on this call from. And John, we really appreciate your time today. Your expertise is great, and really wanted you to be the one kind of speaking about the ins and outs of how this program works. So we appreciate your time.
It was a pleasure.
Awesome. I'm going to quit recording, and hope you all have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.